QSO Today, episode 289, Michael Ritz W7VO. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that they have just the right rig for contestors, DXers, and rag chewers. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. My thanks to both ICOM America and to QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. I mentioned last week that along with Fred Schramm, K2HA, we are planning a tour of Israel in May of next year for ham radio listeners and operators who'd like to tour Israel and do ham radio. If you have an interest, you can put your name on the email list by clicking on the banner on this week's show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. My QSO today is with Mike Ritz, W7VO. Who left the big city for rural Oregon to build his contest station. Mike tells his ham radio story, his role as the ARRL Northwest Division Director and new board member of the ARRL Foundation, and, of course, what he has learned about mentoring new hams to get on the air and to become contest operators. W7VO, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Mike?
Yeah, I am. How are you doing this morning?
I'm great, Mike. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, for me, my amateur radio story really starts back when I was a young kid, about 9 years old. I grew up with my grandparents, and they had an old 1937 Zenith shortwave radio that was up in the attic of the garage. And I had always, was interested in electricity and electronics and taking things apart as a kid. And so they actually dug down the Zenith radio, and I hooked it up in my bedroom and was listening to shortwave broadcasts. This was in probably the mid 1960s, and that kind of got me started being interested in radio. Unfortunately, that radio came to a demise as I proceeded. I was about 9 or 10 years old. I proceeded to dismantle the radio, and eventually used it to jam the television in my grandparents' living room. Whenever they got mad at me and sent me to my room, I'd turn the radio on, set it to a certain frequency, and it would knock their radio out, or knock their television out. And that was kind of my start in radio. Did they get a sense that perhaps you might be behind the sabotage of their television? They never caught on to that, and in the 1980s they passed. And I felt guilty ever since then. They called the TV repairman out a couple of times to figure out what was wrong with it. But I found out that if I hung a wire on a certain pin of a tube on the radio while I had it hanging out of its chassis, I could knock their TV set out. Probably around 4.5 megahertz, which I think was the IF of the TV. And they had TV guys come out, and I'd be in there snickering in my room, and they went to their grave never knowing that I was the one that knocked out their TV games on Saturdays. What was the hometown? This was in Long Beach, California. I grew up in Long Beach and had a great time down there. That's where I got my start in amateur radio. My journey really started as a bicyclist. I was a very avid bicyclist all over Southern California, and as a matter of fact, did a lot of touring and whatnot. And one of my friends down there that I bicycled with had a ham radio license, and kind of. I was into electronics. I kind of knew my way around. And when I was in high school, I was in an occupational electronics class, and so I had a very keen interest in it. And we went by his house one day, and he had this old HT37 and an old SX101 sitting on his table with a ground-mounted vertical. And by God, there were people on there that he could talk to and send Morse code to, and that's what kind of got me hooked. Would you say he was your first Elmer? I think he was my first Elmer. It was Mike WB6DPG, who lives in Monterey now, but then he lived right on the water down in Long Beach, and he was probably the first ham that I ever knew. Was he your contemporary in terms of age? Was he also a high school student? He was a couple of years older. He was, I think, just out of high school. I was in high school at the time, and he was just out of high school. And although I didn't get my license till a few years later. I got my start kind of hanging out with him, and then he started going on these transmitter hunts that started off at Signal Hill once a month, and a bunch of people would meet with their cars on top of Signal Hill, And then they'd have a hidden transmitter down somewhere basically in the city borders of Long Beach. And it could be anywhere. It could be in an old oil site. It could be down by the water. It could be a guy in a shopping cart with a battery-powered transmitter walking dressed as a homeless person. It could be just about anything. We had a lot of fun doing that. I wasn't licensed then, but I did have an HQ 170C old Hammerland receiver strapped to the front seat of my Corvair, and could use a little loop antenna to pick up the signals and be a part of the transmitter hunts. But I wasn't licensed until just a couple of years later than that.
Well, I would imagine, knowing Long Beach as I did as a kid, that you could spend an entire evening wandering around just Long Beach. I was also doing transmitter hunting on Saturday nights for Orange County transmitter hunting. So we started on another hill south of where you were.
Oh, great! It was a lot of fun. I still have fond memories of those days. When the transmitter hunt was over, everyone would get together at a little restaurant called the Grinder down in downtown Long Beach, and it had actually called Pepper Grinder. So every table had a pepper grinder on it, and I still have a pepper grinder here that I keep in my cabinet in my kitchen, and it reminds me of those days of the transmitter hunts.
So you got your first license when?
I got my first license in 1974. It's kind of an interesting story of my career, but I was in an occupational electronics class in high school, which was basically training me to be an electrician or be an electrical repairman. We had to build a 5-tube radio. It was our big senior project in high school, and we took a trip to a Sears service center in Long Beach as a field trip, and they had all these guys in white lab coats. With big giant console TVs hanging out of the cabinets, and I decided that I wanted to be a TV repairman after I got out of high school. So I had a girlfriend. She got accepted to go to UC Santa Cruz, and so we got married when I was 18, and we got a trailer loaded up full of stuff and moved up to Santa Cruz in 1973, and went to work for a TV repair shop, and it was run by a ham, Mike DeWay, who was then WB6VSE, and he was really my first Elmer, the guy that got me my novice license, and the guy that got me really going into amateur radio. And I really owe a lot of my early career to his Elmering.
So your first license was a novice?
That's correct, the novice, WN6HKP in 1974, and then I quickly went from novice to technician, was a technician for a few years, and then got my advanced as WA6HKP and also as a tech as WA6HKP. And it took me 9 years to get my code speed up to get my extra, which I got in 1983, up at on 444 Battery Street in San Francisco, with an unair-conditioned building with jackhammers going on, with the windows open downstairs. It was quite the adventure.
This was Los Angeles or San Francisco?
This was up at San Francisco. I moved to Santa Cruz in late 1973, and then went to work at the TV repair shop in 1973. And then the guy that was the ham, Mike DeWay there, actually left there to go to work for a little company called SBE, you may have heard of, Sideband Engineers. And I went to work so he went to work for SBE. I followed him over from the TV repair shop over to SBE in 1975. And I worked there till 1978 as a ham, and basically doing the repairs on all the ham radio and the commercial equipment. Got my commercial radio telephone license, and worked on all the ham gear. One thing I can say is I've been very fortunate my entire life, Eric, that every job I've gotten all the way through to the end of my career, and I retired in 2014. Every one of my paying jobs I got through amateur radio. Really, one of the things I'm very proud about and very happy to have had as a part of my life.
I think that's amazing. Although I hear this a lot, don't you think? That hams as a community, we pretty much are tight?
Absolutely. It's really a fraternity, and that includes just about everybody, and it's been a huge part of my life pretty much ever since.
Do you remember what your first rig was?
My first rig was the HQ 170C, which I mated with an HT37, and then my first real radio was an old Yaesu FT101B. My first actual radio was a crystal-controlled 2-meter radio that I bought through a Texaco promotion. Believe it or not, and had to make payments on it, as I recall. But it was a little crystal-controlled tube. I forgot the name of the brand name, but it was a little 6-channel crystal-controlled 2-meter radio. Might have been a Hallicrafters or a Regency.
Or a Midland.
Might have been a Midland. Yeah, it was a little. I remember a little black radio, and it had a knob on it. They had 6 channels, but you had to go out and buy the crystals back then.
Yeah, I remember that. I had a Heathkit radio. They had a funky little radio where the transmit and receive crystals had little push-button controls. You could listen on 9.4 and transmit on 7.6 or something like that. So,
wow.
Never needed to do that, but, it was a clever idea.
Yeah.
Your first real radio was an FT101. But, it's funny. I looked just recently on your QRZ page in the log, and it appears that you actually keep your log updated in QRZ. You look like you're a 160-meter CW operator.
Well, I really do a lot of everything. My big forte in amateur radio right now is a combination of contesting and particularly contesting mentoring. And so I like to, one of the reasons that I moved up here to Oregon, which I moved up here in 2007, was to build my dream amateur radio station. And I've pretty much accomplished that now. And I like to bring in a lot of guys that local hams here and try to get them involved in contesting, try to get their skills up. But I'm not a terrific CW op. I never really. I think in order to be a good CW guy, you need to have learned it very early in life. And I really started off my ham radio career as a phone operator, and really never. I was kind of forced into CW. My good friend down there, and really another one of my mentors, was Lloyd Cabral, who is now KH6LC, one of the big contest stations in Hawaii. And he really dogged me to get my code speed up when I was a lot younger. We both kind of grew up together in our 20s, and I've known him for an awful long time. And he really dogged me to get my code speed up to get my extra. So that's what it took me. It took me 9 years to get my extra. And I still enjoy CW. I'm just never really gotten really good at it.
But you make a lot of contacts.
Oh, I certainly make a lot of contacts, but I can't do it at 40 words a minute.
So are you a rag chewer, would you say, or are you just doing contesting when you're doing CW?
No, I'm strictly contester. I can't. I could rag chew at a slow speed, but the contesters, we're all going at 30 words a minute, and so I can pull call signs out pretty easily and pull exchanges out. But if at that speed, there's no way in the world I could rag chew.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your station, because as you describe in your QRZ page, you moved up to Oregon and you bought some acreage for the station.
I've got 2 acres up here, and I'm in a rural area. I'm about 25 miles northwest of Portland, and I bought this house particularly because it was kind of on a hill a little bit. It's all downhill towards the Columbia River. We're about 300 feet in elevation, which isn't real high for a lot of the guys that have stations up here that are, sitting on mountaintops. But it works really well. I've got a really good shot to the north and up to Europe, and a really good shot to the east towards the rest of the U.S.
So could you describe the station a little bit in terms of how you've outfitted it and what it, what you're capable of doing there?
Yeah, what I did was I bought a house here with 2 acres. It's pretty flat, and it says a gradual slope down towards the river. And what I did was I've got a 24-foot by 60-foot shop, and I originally started with 2 rooms in there. And one of the rooms was going to be in my office because I telecommuted for the last 8 years I was working for the company that I worked for in Silicon Valley. And so I built the second room was the radio room, and so I set up a desk up in there and put up a single tower. Well, that kind of grew, and I had to build a second room. I outgrew it, and now I've got basically a 2-station contest station, so we can run single, multi-single, or multi-2. And I've got a third station set up. That's all my old vintage gear. So it's got a Drake C-line. It's got an old Harvey Wells transmitter, an old Hamberland HQ129X receiver. and I can use that as my old vintage station for if I decide I want to run straight key night.
Or maybe the novice roundup or something like that.
Or a novice roundup. And by the way, the novice roundup in 1974 and 1975 was my very first contest. Operated it from Lloyd, who then bet was AA6T down in Aptos, and that was my very first contest. Was running the novice roundup, and that's what actually got my code speed up to 13 words a minute to be able to get my general. Well, actually, general, but I went straight from a technician to advanced.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get outside and be active with ICOM's new IC705 HF to UHF portable transceiver and its optional multifunction backpack. This is ICOM's perfect solution for SOTA and parks on the air. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion with its base station features and functionality at the tips of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds. This beautiful new rig has RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz, and includes a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with a live band scope and waterfall display. Unbelievable. The radio is 5 watts with its internal battery and 10 watts with an external 13.8-volt power supply. This full-featured radio operates on single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Included in this package is a micro USB connector, Bluetooth to support linking to your smartphone or Bluetooth headset, built-in Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone, which is standard equipment. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 with plenty of room for antennas, cables, and other gear to get you on the air from the mountaintop or the local park. There is a link to this amazing new rig on the QSO Today podcast website for this episode, and when you order your new ICOM IC705 from your favorite ham radio dealer, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. So, what does it take to make a great contest station? You said earlier that you're mentoring new hams to be contesters in your contest station. What have you done, do you think, that makes it a great contest station?
I wouldn't call it a great contest station. It's really a medium contest station. I've got 2 towers up with tri-banders on both towers. One tower has got a 3-element stepper on it and then a 2-element 40-meter Yagi. The other tower simply has a tri-bander on it. It's about 300 feet, about 100 meters away from the first tower. And I've got a lot of wire antennas. I've got a big 535-foot diameter loop. It's what makes a good station, I believe, of course, is a lot of money, which I don't have. But, you make the best with what you have. I built a station that's competitive in the U.S. contests. I've got, I don't necessarily get first place, but to me, contesting is a combination of 2 things. It's a contest against yourself, to try to do better in every contest that you do. The primary thing is to have fun. And I've really kind of focused a lot here at my station to bring in guys that are fairly newly licensed, that have an interest in HF operation. Maybe they don't have much of a station at home. And I do have, more than they do here and can offer them and give them a seat in operating contests. And quite a few of the guys, I think I've got 4 or 5 guys now that have graduated and have gone off and built stations of their own, and now they're on their own enjoying the contests.
Now, with new guys who are just getting their licenses, how do you draw them into HF just to begin with? Do you think it's the contest that actually is what kind of cements this relationship with HF?
Well, what cements the relationship to me is when they come in and they see you basically working the world over 48 hours. One of the great things about contesting that I love is that the station and my operators that operate here basically travel around the world every 24 hours. And in a 48-hour contest, you can make two cycles around the world. As you're working Europe in the morning, and then you're working South America in the afternoon, and then Japan starts coming in and Asia, and then the next morning it all starts all over again. And it's really easy to hook somebody when they're coming in here and they're working Japan and running Japan stations, or in the morning and working Europeans. Of course, the be a little easier with the sunspots come back, but that I think really helps get them hooked on it.
Now, do you think that there's an age range where this is more interesting to older people than it is to younger people?
Well, our local ham club here, as I mentioned, I live in a fairly rural area. We're kind of a fairly remote county. There's about 640 square miles here and about 40,000 residents. And we've got a local ham radio club here. And the ham radio club is mostly made up of fairly new hams. There aren't a lot of old hams that live here. So a lot of people now, of course, that are getting their ham radio license are people who are retiring. And as they retire, they've always wanted, they say they've always wanted to get involved in ham radio. And after they retire, they get the chance to do that. And so I've brought some of them over here who've got their ham license, and they have, even as technicians, I can stick them on the air and sit them down and get them working people. And like I said, 4 or 5 of them now have gotten hooked, and they come over here and they are looking forward to contest weekends. I have had kids here as young as 8 years old that have come over here and operated the station, and hopefully, I can keep the spark in them going for the rest of their life, just like what happened to me.
Is there a contest that's better for new operators than older operators? Do you have a preference, or would any contest serve the purpose?
I think probably the DX contests are probably the hardest because they have trouble understanding some of the dialects. A good contest would be, of course, to start off with, what I try to do is try to get people involved with the RITI Roundup. Operating where especially if it's a younger person who's used to using a computer, it's basically computer to computer, tuning in the 2 little marking spaces and N1MM and operating that way. I've just recently got involved in the last RITI Roundup here. We tried to use a combination of FT4 and RITI, and that's an interesting mode, and I think a lot of the younger people seem to really like using that mode.
Are digital modes like FT8, which seems to be very popular right now, can those be used in contests?
Well, they can for RITI Roundup right now, and they've got their own contest. The ARRL right now is trying to work together and put together a basically what will be an FT8, FT4 contest called the Digital Derby. And at our last ARRL board meeting, I'm on the Program and Services Committee as part of that, and they're looking to put together an FT4 type contest.
These modes seem to be kind of automatic, computer run. Do you think that there is a skill set required to run a digital derby?
Absolutely. People are talking about how easy it is to operate FT4 and how easy it is to operate FT8. And I can tell you, based on my experiences with it here over the last 6 months or so, it's not a cakewalk. When you're in a contest mode, in FT4, you still have to call CQ. You still have to get responses. You still have to make the exchange. If somebody's calling CQ and you answer that CQ, you've still got to be the loudest signal that he captures and can decode, or otherwise you're sitting there waiting for somebody else. There's definitely a skill set involved. It's a timing issue, right? To make sure you time things properly. A lot of people scoff at FT4 and FT8, but I've really become a fan of it.
If you hear a station calling, would you actually respond to them on the same frequency, or did these digital modes allow you to go down 10 or up 10?
No, the digital modes, I don't think you've ever used FT4, FT8, but basically you wind up with a little waterfall display across the top, and a FT4 signal or FT8 signal uses about 2.3 kilohertz of bandwidth, and you can fit about 40 or 50 different signals in there. And so it'll basically decode everything within that 2.3 kilohertz bandpass. And so you can see 5 or 6 people that are calling CQ at the same time. And what you do is you click on them to call them back. and it calls back on their frequency. And that part of it's pretty much automatic, but you still have to be heard and decoded by the other station. And sometimes you are, and sometimes you aren't. It still goes back to who's the loudest signal.
So is there an advantage to being the guy that's making the CQs versus the guy that's responding?
I think it's probably easier to call CQ and have people call you and you click on responses than it is for you to try to answer CQs. When we were operating the RITI Roundup here several weeks ago, the main station was running a kilowatt, and we had another station set up operating under different call sign that was using FT4 and only running 100 watts. And 100 watts in a contest is a challenge, and we found it as a challenge even in FT4.
So the majority of your new contesters are working either voice or digital modes because perhaps they're new; they don't have the CW experience.
That's correct. Yeah, especially voice. If I bring somebody in, I'm going to put them on a voice contest, we operate. And the reason one of the reasons I do a lot of contesting here is that I'm a member of the Willamette Valley DX Club, which is based here in Portland, and we've got about 90 members, and we actually do a contest with all the other DX clubs in the Northwest. The Western Washington DX Club, the Orca guys up in British Columbia, the Idaho DX Association, and the Spokane DX Association. And we actually have a contest within a contest where we aggregate points in 10 major contests every year. And there's a trophy that goes around, which right now is actually sitting in my shack in my downstairs. And that's handed out every year at the Pacific Northwest DX Convention for the team, basically the club with the highest aggregate score total in those 10 contests. So we're on at least for those 10 contests every year. And those are the ones that I try to bring in the new operators in. And I've got a group of guys now that have been doing it for a few years, and they're still enjoying it.
In your part of the world, is a DX club different than like a regular ham radio club?
Well, it is in the fact that it's mostly guys. Back in the old days, when I first joined the club, in order to even be a member of the club, you had to already have your DXCC certificate. They've since dropped that requirement, but it's mostly guys that are interested in, DX, which is working stations, far, far away, and also it's kind of morphed into even more than DX is the contesting side of it. We've got some very active contesters in the Northwest here, and we all enjoy doing that.
Is operating DX then an alternative to operating a contest? It's not a contest weekend, for example. Will you operate or hunt DX the same way that you might work a contest?
You can. It's a little bit different. I have a saying that I always talk about is that every contester is by default a DXer, because in the contest world, all those countries out there are count as multipliers for the contest, right? A multiplier score basically makes your score a lot larger. The contest scoring is usually the number of contacts that you make in a certain period of time times the multiplier. And the multipliers are usually countries, or they could be CQ zones, or they could be a combination of both. There could be states in a domestic contest, for example, field day or something like that. And so every contester is a DXer, but not every DXer is a contester. There's guys that want to try to get on the honor roll and work every single possible country that there is out there. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to do that. That takes a lot of time and perseverance. You've got to be on at 3 o'clock in the morning and get up, because you'll know the station's going to be on. You find out this guy's going to be on in some rare country, and you've got to be on when there's good propagation path conditions between your place and his place, and that's really a challenge. The good part about contesting is the contest starts, it ends, and you can take a break from it for a while.
Does your contest station have facility for your hams to actually stay overnight?
It does. I've got a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, and I've got a 1-bedroom, 1-bath apartment underneath the house. So we've got full facilities and kitchen, and I've even got the ability to have people sleep in there when they're not operating. Most of my guys are local here. As I mentioned, I'm in a fairly rural county. I have a few guys that come up from like Salem, 50, 75 miles away, but they generally come in and work in shifts, and then they'll go back home again.
Now, you mentioned your friend in Hawaii.
That was Lloyd, who's now KH6LC, one of the biggest contest stations in Hawaii.
Right. So I saw that you maintain his website. That's the kh6lc.com website. Do you go to Hawaii and operate from Lloyd Station?
I've only really gone over there once. I went over there for the 2012 ARRL phone contest, and we finished third in the world from over there. There were four of us operating, and we finished from Hawaii. We finished third in the world in that contest. I'm really proud of that. That's one of my ham radio contest achievements. He's got a much larger station than I have. I've got two towers up that are relatively short. They're only 60 feet tall. And he's got, I think, four towers up that are 90 feet tall with big monobanders on them, and a very first-class world-class station.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. I read that you have served 3 terms as president of the, is it Willamette Valley DX Club?
Willamette Valley DX Club, yes.
Willamette. This is how we pronounce it in the West. Willamette Valley DX Club. Your 4 terms as ARRL Northwestern Division Director.
No, I was 3 terms, Willamette Valley DX Club, and then I actually quit that job when I got elected as the Northwestern Division Director in 2018.
You're still serving your first term.
That's correct. Yeah, I just started in 2018. I've served until at least 2021.
And now you're a board member of the ARRL Foundation.
That's correct also.
Why is leadership in amateur radio organizations important to you?
I think it is to try to make sure that we're able to maintain the hobby. I'm on the ARRL Foundation, which is the scholarship arm and the grant arm of the ARRL. It's actually a different separate company. And there we deal with scholarships. I'm on the scholarship committee, and I get to take a look at the resumes of all these new hams coming up and match them up with scholarships. And that's really, to me, a very exciting and very rewarding part of the hobby. As I mentioned before, my two big things are, number 1 is contesting, and number 2 is mentoring. And the fact that I get the opportunity to deal with these young hams and work on scholarships and being part of their ham radio journey is very important to me.
How much money does the ARRL Foundation give out every year in terms of scholarships to ham radio students that are going to colleges and stuff?
Yeah, this year I think we gave out about $126,000 worth of scholarships.
That's a significant number.
It is. It's not a large per student. The average was probably, I would say, around $1,000. There's several. We have, I think, 4 or 5 $5,000 scholarships, and a few that are $500. And of course, these are all scholarships that are set up by members, either in memoriam or active members, who have put aside money and donated it to the foundation. We have about, I think, pretty close to $5 million in assets right now that we're dealing with that are available for scholarships.
And how important do you think it is for the ARRL Foundation to provide scholarships to students? Do you think that this is a kind of a long-term investment in amateur radio by funding students through school?
Absolutely. I mean, you think of the future of amateur radio, and the future of amateur radio are these people these kids that are applying for scholarships. One of the requirements is they have to have a ham radio license. Now, some of the kids, if you look at their resumes, they were very, very active on the air. Some of them are not so active, and hopefully the idea is that they'll eventually, if they not using their license now because they're busy with school, that they'll maintain it and maintain the future. If you take a look at the overall demographics of amateurs as a whole in the United States, it's a little bit different in Europe, a lot younger demographic in Europe. But the average ham now is got to be pushing 60, 65 years old. You just need to go to just about any ham radio club meeting. There's an awful lot of gray hairs there. And in 20 years from now, ham radio in the U.S. could be falling off a cliff. As all these, the guys my age, I'm 66 years old. As guys my age will be in their 80s then, and who's going to replace us? And it's going to have to be younger hands.
Does the ARRL Foundation, after it awards scholarships to its students, does it make an effort to keep in touch with those students, maybe even create opportunities for them to get together in some way, or to create leadership roles for younger hams in organizations, in ham radio organizations?
Well, no, it doesn't. We deal with a different crop of hams every year. The ARRL Foundation is 100% run by volunteers. They're all volunteer directors. One of the things that we're doing now, and we're going to actually be having a conference call tomorrow night, is looking at other things the foundation can do other than strictly scholarships and grants. We also do grants for science programs and whatnot. Not as so many this last couple of years, but that's a great idea, and maybe something that we should consider. We're definitely looking at other ways to branch out. We're kind of resource limited because we are dealing strictly with volunteers and people who already have other jobs as being an ARRL board member, which is really a lot of work. So that's certainly a good idea.
There are a lot of hams that are very cynical about organizations, and that they believe that the ham radio organizations, perhaps like the ARRL, are actually ruled at the board level, and that the rest of the elected delegates, they may have some input, but that the real decisions are made in the board. How do you feel about this belief with regard to amateur radio organizations where you've served?
Well, I can tell you that I think there's a little bit of truth to that. I mean, at least there was. I came on the board last year amid a lot of controversy over this a new code of conduct that the board had adopted and had censured. I don't know if you've heard about the N6AA censure, but I was one of 4 new directors that was voted in last January to kind of make the league more transparent and get the members more involved in it. I mean, it's a membership organization. It's here. The ARRL is here to serve amateur radio, and you can't do that if the organization's only looking, towards the inside. You've got to look outside, and you've got to be more receptive and more, basically listen more to what the members have to say. I fully support that.
And what do you think the primary issues then are for members that you represent?
I think that a lot of them are worried about the future of the hobby, as what we can do to bring in more hams. The ARRL in particular only has about 20% of the total amateur radio population. And one thing I want to make distinguish here is the difference between a licensee and a ham. There are a lot of people right now that are getting ham radio licenses that will never become hams. And there are people that go to a Red Cross meeting and the Red Cross our seminar presenter talks about the big one, the next big earthquake coming, and how everybody needs to be prepared. And they'll tell them to go out and get their ham radio license so they'll be able to communicate when everything else is down. And so they go out, they get their ham radio license, maybe they join a CERT team, and then that's where their ham radio journey ends. And the thing to do is try to get them from being a licensee and having a ham radio license to being a ham, where they actually get on the air, they do things, they learn, and they become part of this hobby.
And do you think that the marketing efforts then to go after those licensees should be the national organization like the ARRL, or do you think that it could be localized to the local ham clubs or to even the regional directors and the regional sub-directors?
I really think it's a combination of both, and that's one of the things that I'm really trying to stress right now, is that it really belongs at the club level. I got my start through, guys that were members of the Ham Radio Club in Santa Cruz, and that's where I met Lloyd. That's where I met a lot of the guys that were members of that club. And but it's a combination of both. The ARRL has to be able to provide the clubs the resources for them to be mentors for the next generation of hams. It really comes down to the groundwork being done at the club level, but then the resources to give them the tools they need has to come from the national organization, and that national organization is the ARRL.
It appears to me, at least from what I've heard and what I've read, is that National Parks on the Air was a very, very successful venture from the ARRL. Do you think that the ARRL has up its sleeve similar kinds of programs that could be upcoming?
Definitely. They're definitely always looking at more ways to get people involved, get them on the air. The W1AW stroke whatever, stroke 7 thing that they had during the ARRL's 100th anniversary in 2014 was also a huge success. And, coming up with different programs and ideas to bring more people involved. I think 2020 or 2021 was our last board meeting. We talked about they're coming up with ways now to get colleges involved more and try to get more of the college stations on the air. To try to get college stations going and get them active. And that's really going to be a focus, I think, over the next couple of years for the league. That's one of the things that came up in the last board meeting.
Take a lot of these college stations out of the mothballs where they may have been for years.
Exactly. There are several that have been restarted again. Probably the most active college station is the one at Stanford University there in Northern California, W6YX. As a matter of fact, I worked them in the 160 contest here just a couple of nights ago. And the idea is to get more of these college stations reactivated, get them on the air, get them working each other. And that's going to be a big focus of the ARRL here moving over the next couple of years.
I'm not criticizing the ARRL. I don't want to. As long as I've been active, I've been an ARRL member, and I think that everyone should belong to the ARRL primarily because of spectrum defense. It seems like everybody wants our frequencies.
They not only want them, they're willing to pay the FCC a lot of money for them.
And the FCC is very willing to take that money.
We are battling right now to try to keep at least some small portion of our 3.5 gigahertz band, and also try to maintain the ability to have access to the 5.9 gigahertz band, which is very important right now in the ham WAN arena.
Right, the whole mesh networking arena.
Exactly. That's really another very key part, important part of amateur radio moving forward. And you want to get young kids involved. You're going to get the hacker kids, the ones that can go in and hack the routers and look at it from the IT side of it. And that's really the future of where amateur radio is headed, maybe 10, 15 years down the road. And we are in a very serious condition right now of losing access to a lot of those frequencies, as the FCC, has a big push right now towards the 5G network and finding more frequencies for the 5G network to use. And the ham radio, unfortunately, is in the way of some of that.
Wouldn't you agree that it's kind of a cart before the horse kind of thing, in that our use of the 2.4 gigahertz, the 3.5 gigahertz, and the 5.8 gigahertz ranges was really dependent on the availability of low-cost gear that allowed us to start building these ham WAN mesh networks?
Absolutely.
But those bands sat empty, except for microwave DXers, for years and years, who weren't even using even a portion of the bands. So now that we actually have the ability to start deploying over very large areas these microwave networks in these bands, now the bands are becoming subject for potential expropriation by other services.
Well, the reason we got the bands in the first place is that nobody else wanted them. There was nobody else up there. And of course, as the cellular network has grown over the last few years and continues to grow, it has a larger and larger appetite for frequency. And as you know, the FCC auctions off that spectrum for very large sums of money, and unfortunately, we don't have the activity, and we're certainly not a revenue source for the FCC. So we're very fortunate to have David Siddall, K3ZJ, who is our FCC counsel for the ARRL. And he was working very diligently with them, really to a level that I don't think we've seen in a long time, to try to preserve as much of these frequencies as we can.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. You know, you're kind of opening the robe to the ARRL here today. I hope you don't mind, Mike.
No, not a problem.
If you don't mind my asking some questions about it, because I think that what I felt when I saw that National Parks on the Air was ending, that there didn't appear to be something that was coming in right behind it. You know, it was such a successful program that it ended well, but then there was nothing else there. So it's perhaps the listeners are wondering, like I'm wondering, is that because these programs are coordinated on a volunteer level, or is it because it was actually handled by staff members in the ARRL who didn't have another project or they left, and so there were no projects that came forth? Do we depend upon the ARRL staff for programs like National Parks on the Air?
I believe that to be the case. I know there's been a pretty good turnover the last few years of some of the staff, especially involved with radio sport, and there's been a lot of turmoil back there. I think we're getting to the end of the turmoil period. But that's where a lot of these programs started with, were ideas from some of the staff at the ARRL. To put something like National Parks on the Air out there, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of work from the people at the staff level, and they've obviously got a lot to do also in their normal parts of their job. But I think what you're saying has a lot of validity to it.
Well, on the one hand. On the other hand, I think that maybe it's the way we're thinking now. Now I'm free associating. I apologize to all the listeners when I free associate. What I'm thinking is that one of the reasons that the ARRL has always been the center of all of these activities is because its mouthpiece was the magazine, QST, that it published on a regular basis. But now that we have social media and we've got Facebook and we've got websites and all that stuff, it seems to me that just about anybody could start any kind of program that they wanted and launch it on a national or international basis. Maybe SOTA is an example of something like that.
No, I think you're definitely right. And but the problem isn't just in setting it up; it's in tracking it. And tracking it takes a lot of resources. You know, you've got all the paperwork involved in sending out the awards, and it's not, anybody can set up the event, but I think running the event is the larger portion of the event. It's like putting on a contest. You've got to not only come up with the ground rules, put out a contest, get people to operate the contest, then you've got you might have 2,000 or 3,000 logs to deal with when you're done. The W1AW, when they had their 100th anniversary and had basically W1AW on the air, where they had people use their stations at home to be portable W1AW. I was here for Oregon for a week, and when you get all done, they had literally thousands and thousands of QSO cards to deal with back at headquarters. So they really kind of made a headache for themselves, but it was a very popular event.
Do you use a Logbook of the World?
Yes, I do. I've got about 25,000 contacts loaded up in there since 2007.
And does that sync with your QRZ page? Because I noticed that your QRZ page log is actually updated.
Well, what I do is every time I run a contest, I take the ADIF file from the contest, and I automatically load it up to QRZ, and I automatically load it up to Logbook of the World. The two aren't synced. I don't have them synced together, but all my contest logs wind up getting loaded up to both different platforms.
Now, did I hear you say earlier that N1MM is your choice of contest logging software?
Correct.
Why is that?
I've been using it for a long time, and I really enjoy using it. It's pretty seamless. I think it's free, which is really good. I mean, some of the contest software you have to pay for. It's a free software. It's very well supported. Every time I load it up to operate a contest, it automatically updates. So there's never any manually waiting for stuff to update. It does it automatically. It's a very well thought out, very seamless program that interfaces very well with my radios. I change bands, it changes bands. I change frequency, it changes frequency, and it's just it really works very, very bug free.
I must say that I discovered online that you did a very nice PowerPoint presentation on how to set up N1MM for contest logging.
I've given that presentation several times at our local CPAC, our big Northwestern Division convention. I've given that program a few times, and it's a very basic, easy to use program, and it could also, by the way, operates very well in a multi environment. You can actually have 4 or 5 different transmitters, and the computers for those will all sync together, and you have one log for maybe 4 or 5 different stations.
I see. So you can network all your computers together.
That's correct. And so you have one log for everything.
And all of the equipment together. Can you interlock the transceivers if you're on N1MM, so in a contest environment, someone doesn't actually put one of the stations on the same frequency band that another station is operating on?
That's a good question, and I've never really tried that. I haven't had that problem here because I do manual interlock. So if one transmitter is on, you don't want to have the second transmitter on. I can interlock where they'll basically only be one on at a time. But I do believe that ability is within N1MM, but it does take some hardware to do that.
Can we go back to leadership in amateur radio organizations? Would you encourage hams to become involved in leadership?
I would, not necessarily about leadership, but I think I would definitely have them be more involved as an Elmer and a mentor. A lot of ham radio clubs now have a little Elmer station where somebody will come in there. If they have a question, they come ask an Elmer. One thing I think that amateurs really, really need to do a lot better of, looking towards the future of amateur radio, is being what I had as a young kid, and that's be an Elmer, and teach the next generation of amateurs, your passion of the hobby. And that's really the mentoring is, I can't stress how important that is. And a lot of clubs don't do that, and a lot of clubs do. And the clubs that do a lot of mentoring are growing. And the clubs that don't do the mentoring are probably floundering about now.
I think there's a lot of people our age who've been hams for a long time that take it for granted that putting a PL259 on the end of a piece of RG8 coax is actually relatively easy to do. We take it for granted. I don't think it's easy to do at all. And I think that for a new ham that's never done it before, that it can be a daunting task without some Elmering. So I think I agree with you 100% that there's a lot of things that we think about that we do almost automatically because we've been doing it for 50 years, that for a new ham, even with some technical expertise, this is a big project.
Oh, definitely. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you know or not, but the ARRL has just started putting out a new magazine called On the Air. And members can actually either subscribe to it or to QST. And a lot of the new hams are opting for the On the Air. But the On the Air magazine is like QST, only it's strictly for beginners. So it talks about how to make a coat hanger 2-meter ground plane antenna, and how to put on a coax connector and stuff like that. And so the league is trying to bring it down where the new ham, if they maybe don't have the mentor available to them because their club doesn't really do mentoring, is they can learn this stuff through the ARRL and through this new magazine. And if you haven't seen that, I'd highly recommend you check it out, Eric.
Well, I'm going to actually subscribe to it. I get QST. I try to get all the magazines because I like to kind of be up to date in terms of what's happening in amateur radio. Let me ask you, it's my understanding that you have another hobby besides amateur radio. Do you want to explain what that might be?
Well, I have. I've also got a race car. And if you've looked on my website, you notice I've got a picture of me sitting in the race car. But I kind of put amateur radio aside while my kids were growing up. My kids were never really interested in the radio side of things. However, they were interested in mechanics, especially one of my son who is a mechanic, is a race car mechanic now. And I actually put together a race car and raced it for about 20 years up and down the West Coast. doing a thing that's called historic vintage racing. I built up a 1966 Plymouth Barracuda, and it's really a long story, another whole separate story, but had this second hobby going that kind of grew into its own life over the course of about 20 years. And when I retired, I pretty much put the race car away. Racing a car is a lot more expensive than amateur radio is, and really started focusing back on the amateur radio side of things. But I had a long run, and quite a bit of success with doing car racing. Once again, to try to involve my kids more into it. And also because when I lived in Mountain View in California, I lived on a city lot, and I had a lot of RFI problems with my neighbors. And I finally had to kind of almost shut my station down. That's one of the reasons I moved up to Oregon, was to get away from the having to operate and try to operate a station in a city environment. And I was very fortunate to be able to do that.
How important was getting the W7VO call sign, and what does that mean to you?
It was extremely important. When I first moved up here, I'm one of the people that really believe that you should have a call sign that reflects where you actually live. Being a contester, if I work a 7, I know he's going to be up in the Northwest or be down in Arizona, but basically be on the West Coast. But with the system they have now, it really could be anywhere in the country. And so when I moved up here, I was originally KW6C, and I applied for a few call signs until I finally got W7VO. And I can say it's extremely important to me because I found out that the guy that had the call sign before me had a lot of parallels to myself. He raced cars for a while. He was a very active amateur. He had a contest station down in Arizona. His name was Andy Anderson. And before him, it was Charles Newcomb. When I first got this call sign, I found it had quite a bit of history, and so I really got into learning about the history of the call sign and have traced it all the way back to the early 1920s. And I got a hold of some of the relatives, and some of the relatives got a hold of me when I got the call sign. And, to me, a very important part of amateur radio is the history of amateur radio. I don't know if you also noticed, but I've also put together a program that I give to a lot of clubs up here, and I've done it at our convention, called The History of the Ham Radio Call Sign, where I trace the history of our call signs all the way back to the times back before we had call signs, and people were just using their initials. And so the history of the hobby and the history of who we are as amateurs is very important to me.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
It's had a huge impact. My wife is a ham. She's obviously not as active as I am, but she knew my passion for amateur radio very, very early in our relationship. As a matter of fact, she actually went up to the FCC office in San Francisco when we were living in Santa Cruz, and she actually went up there and studied for her test and studied for her license, and actually went up there and took the test and came home with a passing grade without me even knowing about it before we were married. And so she's been involved with it as part of what I do here for many years, and I'm very, very grateful for that.
Does she get on the air?
Occasionally, she'll come in and help out for the contest, but no, she's not terribly active. I think the contest side of it is kind of intimidating to her. She is very active in our local Aries group here. We're both active in our local emergency communications group here in Columbia County, Oregon, and she is very actively involved in the Aries side of things. She's not so much in the contest. I think it's kind of daunting for her, but she is involved with our local Aries program.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think it's the new technologies that are coming out. These Joe Taylor's FT-X modes, I think, are reinvigorating amateur radio when it really needs invigorating. Interesting to note that I'm also on the band planning committee for the ARRL board, and we are looking at moving around some of the digital allocations to try to separate wideband and narrowband. And we had to do some research as part of this. And if you look at we took a look at some PSK reporter snapshots of amateur radio activity in the digital portions, the CW portions of the bands, and I can tell you that the FT8 and FT4 modes have literally taken over amateur radio. And that's great because they're low signal, they're what they call weak signal modes, where you don't have to have a great a great antenna. You don't need to have a lot of power. You can work in an apartment with an indoor antenna and work the world. And I think that's a very exciting part of the hobby coming forward. Obviously, I'm looking forward to the sunspots starting to come back starting next year as we start the new cycle 25. Looking forward to that and getting back. I think that's going to help a lot towards getting people more involved, especially on HF.
Do you think that technician class amateurs, well, I guess are maybe today's novices, do you think that they should have digital privileges on 40, 20, 15?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As the league, as you may know, the league put out a proposal to the FCC, which is RM 11828, which is what's called the Technician Enhancement Proposal. And it would do exactly that. It would give them the ability to use digital in all their current allocations and also give them some limited phone privileges on the top end of the 80, 40, and 15 meter bands. They already have some phone privileges on 10. And get them involved in the hobby more. I go to a lot of club meetings, and the one thing I ask the club members is, how many of you technicians in here have ever been on CW? And I can pretty much guarantee you the answer is always zero. So CW is just not getting the technicians involved as it did back when I was a novice and a technician.
Those were our only choices in those days.
That were our only choices, but now they got this thing called digital, and I certainly hope this proposal that the ARRL has put forth, it's like I mentioned, it's RM 11828. I sure hope it passes because that will give the technicians digital privileges. That's going to open up a whole new world for them.
What advice would you give to new returning hams to the hobby?
Keep going. Keep going, and the number one thing I can say is get on the air. Having a license is one thing. But actually getting there, find a ham. If you are a new guy, find a ham in your area that will be a mentor for you. Find an active club that has a mentoring program and be part of the hobby. Don't just get a license and get a radio and throw it in your go bag and throw your go bag in the closet. Be part of the hobby, be part of the experience, and enjoy it.
Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It's been very informative, and I wish you a lot of luck in the leadership positions that you've taken in the hobby. With that, I want to wish you 73.
Thank you very much, and I certainly appreciate it. Have a good day.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Mike. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W7VO in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support for these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at the checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 300. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. Special thanks to Ben Bresky, who now edits the audio for this QSO Today podcast from the audio pieces that I give him. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.